Okay. Well, I want us to get started because there's a lot to talk about today. My name is Sarah Truitt. I work at City of Sanctuary UK, and we are delighted today to have Lou Calvi and Tracy Hammer from the Safer Foundations team to be here. And can I just make a note, a couple of things? We will be recording today. So if you do not want to be visible or if you want to change your name, please go ahead and do that. Also, please put yourself on mute. So you can, we will have time at the end for questions and answers, and there'll be a chance for everyone to get involved and have comments. But if you could keep yourself on mute while we're doing the presentation section, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn over to, I think, Lou, are you going to be starting first? Yeah, fantastic. So over to Lou to get us started on our discussion today about safeguarding.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah, and thanks to you all for attending today. Lovely to be invited in, as ever, by the wonderful team at City of Sanctuary. I'm Lou Calvi. I am one of the co-directors for Safer Foundations, which is a new refugee, asylum and vulnerable migrant safeguarding support organisation. Up until recently, I was the head of services and safeguarding for Refugee Action, working across the UK. I'll just hand over to Tracy.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, my name's Tracy. So I'm the other co-director of Safer Foundations. I'm really excited to be here today and share some of the work that we're sort of doing around safeguarding in the sector. Just a bit about my background. I'm a social worker by training. I've worked in child protection in local authorities. I've worked for the NSPCC in child safeguarding, and more recently I've been sort of national safeguarding manager at Refugee Action. So this is my real passion.
We've prepared a short slide pack for you today. So we're going to turn to that presentation now. And as Sarah said, there's going to be hopefully plenty of time for questions at the end. But essentially today, we are, there we go, just catching up. The next slide, please. And the next slide, please. Sorry. There we go. So the outline of today, we've only got we're aiming to cover about 35 minutes for this presentation. So we're just going to cover very briefly, a little bit of a gallop through the sort of approach to safeguarding, the framing to safeguarding, specifically when working with refugees, asylum seekers and other vulnerable migrant communities. We're going to be looking at some of the common issues that client group may face and what you need to do in terms of safeguarding compliance and then best practice safeguarding. As I said, we've only got sort of 30 minutes for this sort of presentation, so we're only going to touch on some of these things. But if you do have any questions, as I said at the end, please do share those. We've tried to make this presentation applicable to all different sorts of organisations in different situations. So there may be some variations on exact precise approaches depending on the status of the individual and depending on the local operating environment. But hopefully most of what we cover should apply to all of you in your situation. Next slide, please. Tracy.
Great. So we just wanted to start off by talking about safety or safeguarding. So I think a lot of the time we hear this word safeguarding, it can be quite a scary term in some senses, and it often sits aside from the work that we're doing day to day in whatever capacity we are supporting refugees and migrant communities. So Lou and I have toyed with this idea a lot around actually what is it we mean by safeguarding, you know, when supporting people within our sector. And we feel really, really strongly around safeguarding as a tool of advocacy. So rather than safeguarding sitting outside of that day-to-day work that we're doing supporting people, actually, if we bring safeguarding front and centre and view it in the terms of safety, trying to lower risk and create safety for everybody that we're supporting, then actually that becomes really central to every part of the work that we're doing. We don't want safeguarding to be ticking a box. We feel that a lot of the fear around safeguarding comes from the compliance element. So rather than necessarily working to the human in front of us, all these regulations that we need to meet in order to safeguard people can sometimes overtake some of the work that we're doing. Whereas again, if we bring safety front and centre and think about what does this person need that we're supporting, actually safeguarding and safety is a massive part of that. And it's something that we do day in, day out without thinking about a lot of the time. Probably 90 to 100% of the people that we're supporting and working with, you know, there will be safeguarding elements, there will be risk. There's risk attached to most humans, and we are often supporting, you know, some of the most vulnerable people in society. So bringing that back centrally to our casework can really shift that approach and shift that attitude and help us to use these safeguarding resources that we're going to move on and talk about as that real tool of advocacy. And not only are we talking about, you know, people that we're supporting, our clients, you know, well-being, staff and volunteer safety. Again, when we're thinking about vulnerabilities and vicarious trauma and some of the experiences that we are seeing and hearing every day, and those systems that create a lot of unsafety for people, we have to be really mindful of how safeguarding sits within our staff and volunteer teams as well. So that forms sort of part of this holistic approach to safeguarding. And as I said, you know, we work with some of the most marginalised people in the UK. There is risk everywhere in all of the sessions that sort of we facilitate and attend. The biggest feedback that we hear is around, you know, mental health crises, services at breaking point. What can we do to help people to access services? And obviously that is not just about our clients in isolation. There's obviously that big systemic problem around that at the moment. But actually, when we look at the layer upon layer of additional barriers and risks that some of our clients face around racism, around the asylum system, around language barriers, actually everything we're doing every day is trying to challenge that, and that is all safety, it's all safeguarding, even if we haven't always traditionally looked at it in that way. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that just brings us on to sort of thinking about reframing safeguarding. So because of some of those areas and how we've maybe traditionally thought of safeguarding, and I include myself in that, how do we start to look at that in our day-to-day work as different organisations to ensure that we are creating safety for the people that we're supporting? So obviously, when we're thinking about those wider elements that are potentially out of our control other than the campaigning aspect, we're looking at that statutory and policy environment where, you know, it actively creates risk in certain situations. So we acknowledge that we're working in a really difficult environment where we can't just make a referral to a local authority or refer into another voluntary organisation, because actually some of these risks that are around us are really, really challenging to sort of come across and to get over, especially when we work in a system of sort of systemic and structural racism as well. We know the impact that has on our client group. We know the additional risks around hate crime, the barriers that people face daily to access general services as well. And then the trauma that people carry from the country of origin and dangerous journeys, and then the re-traumatisation as well from the asylum system in the UK. So all these areas obviously are creating risk along the way. And some of them sit separately to, again, that traditional way we've viewed safeguarding, that sort of local authority referral, or ring the police if there's an emergency, we need to contact 999. Actually, these are all areas that we're working to every single day when we're supporting people within these communities. And obviously we're in a cost of living crisis, which adds to our sort of the levels of poverty and destitution that we're seeing, and also feeding into sort of the trafficking and exploitation risks. And that is a whole training in itself, so we'll only touch on that today, but being alive to some of those additional risks that are created because of the systemic challenges that we're facing in society. And then because of some of obviously the legislative elements at the moment as well, thinking about family reunification and risk of dangerous crossings, even if the people that we're supporting within our own organisations, we can create a level of safety around how far are we looking when we're thinking about safety and safeguarding of, you know, family members, and the risks of you know, emotional impact and those challenges that we see outside of families as well as inside. And then I think I've touched on as well the language and conceptual barriers that exist for our client group. They're so pervasive, and it really means that every piece of work we're doing has that safety, that safeguarding element, because we're up against these challenges every single day. We'll just move on to our next slide. Brilliant. So in light of that, and it sounding quite negative and me saying there's all these risks, all these challenges, actually there's quite a lot that we can do as organisations within this sector to just shift our approach slightly and really start using safeguarding as that tool of advocacy that I keep mentioning. So having that root and branch approach, pivoting organisations around the acknowledgement that, you know, 90 to 100% of people that we're supporting will be at risk in some way. We're not in any way trying to say every client is traumatised or every client is at risk of exploitation, but there is risk in some element with the majority of the people that we're supporting. And when we acknowledge that and bring that into our service delivery, it can make a massive difference in how our confidence levels are in terms of approaching safeguarding and how our staff and volunteer teams see risk. We want a service approach that embeds addressing and escalating risk and using safeguarding as an escalation tool. So not seeing it as an additional task that we have to do on top of our day-to-day work. Actually, if we can bring some of this safeguarding advocacy into our day-to-day work, we can get better outcomes for clients that we're supporting, whether it's using mental health GP reports, evidence to help somebody be moved to an area where they have a support system, or whether it's that somebody's already linked into services and we can really strongly advocate for them around that. I've just lost the slides. Is it just on mine or?
No, I've lost the slides too.
Oh.
I'm not sure who was sharing their screen.
No, that's fine. I can
share. Shall I share my screen? Because I've got. Oh, no.
There we go.
Ah, there we go.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I think we were on slide 6.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think, yeah, bringing that into our day-to-day work rather than having that as a separate can really help us to get all everybody on board within the organisation so that it's not an extra task. And then when we start to see some of those positive outcomes where we're using our safeguarding approaches to really sort of make impactful change for people. And that's not saying every situation we will now suddenly get a better outcome. It's still really, really difficult, but actually bringing that outcome, that sort of work front and centre to work towards the outcome that we were trying to work towards anyway is something that can just really add to our toolkit when supporting people within our sector. We can offer solutions and we can feed into national campaigns as well. So one of the aims of our organisation, Safer Foundations, is to really start collating some of the data that we're seeing across the sector, looking at, you know, how many of our clients are experiencing mental health crisis, how many of that is because of accommodation issues, how many of it is because of family reunion issues, looking at what are these safeguarding issues and risks that are creating the most sort of systemic problems for people, and how can we take this back to national campaigns. So we're trying to work with some of the bigger charities as well to really feed this back to sort of the Home Office and look at how safeguarding really is key to all that work that we're doing. And I think before I hand back over to Lou, the last point I want to finish on is that again, when we're thinking about safeguarding, people have so many more expertise than they sometimes realise. Some people are really confident, and you know, I'm aware here that there'll probably be people with really a diverse range of professional backgrounds in different elements of safeguarding, whether that's in domestic abuse services or in social care and local authorities. But I think we sometimes overlook some of those skills within our organisation when thinking about safeguarding. And actually what we do every single day is try and create that safety for people. So you're all professionals within that already, is what I'll leave that point on. And I'll hand over to you, Lou.
Thanks, Tracy. I think we were on slide 7. If it's all right, I might just share it myself. If I've got it. Okay. Can you see my slide pack, anyone? Yes. Okay. Good. Let me just put it on presenter view. I can figure out how to do that. Sorry about this, everyone. Slideshow. There we go. Let's click through. Take it to 7. There we go. Is that okay for everyone? Can everyone see that? Lovely. So I actually have gone one slide too far. So operational considerations when you're working with migrant communities, and by that we mean asylum seekers, refugees, but also people that have been refused asylum, NRPF status. So when I talk about vulnerable migrant communities, it's that umbrella term for the variety of status that people may have. As Tracy was saying, we're really, really passionate about safeguarding being used as a tool. Safeguarding practice and requirements shouldn't take away from, but they should give to. And too often, I think as organisations, we think, oh, you know, if you're a busy organisation, busy casework service, and you're thinking, oh no, I haven't got time to fill out a safeguarding form, and I haven't got time to go through all of those escalation frameworks, because actually the vast majority of people that we're working with have experienced mental health crisis. They may have suicidal ideation. They're living in grindingly extreme levels of poverty. And we know that makes them the vultures that our exploiters circle around our client group. So what we try and do in Safer Foundations is say, actually, if we acknowledge the risk around our client, and we come from a position of actually understanding that they need to get out of the system that they're in, if that's the asylum system, or get into the asylum system if they're refused NRPF, how can safeguarding help us work that system in the way that it is? And it has to give tools to the organisation. It has to give us something to escalate those concerns. So I've listed here a few of the things for you guys to consider. Home Office have a safeguarding hub. Tracy's going to cut and paste the email addresses for these escalation routes in the chat for you guys. If you're coming across anyone that's experiencing difficulty and are in a situation of risk and they're within the asylum system, you should be escalating that to the Home Office Safeguarding Hub straight away. It's a simple email, you pop it through, you tell them what the risk is, and tell them what needs to happen in order to address that. Now, the Home Office have 2 core contractors within the asylum system, obviously, Migrant Help and the accommodation provider. So, and what you tend to find is that each one of those 3, Home Office Safeguarding Hub, Migrant Help, and the accommodation provider, will ping pong you among the other 3, and they'll shuffle the issue across. So you email Migrant Help and they'll say, raise it with the accommodation provider. And then you email the accommodation provider and they'll say, oh, talk to Migrant Help about it. So what I tend to do is send one email to all 3 and say, these are your contractors, this is your system, this is your responsibility, this is the risk this human being is in. So always do that. whenever you've got anyone in a situation of risk. Be mindful that the Home Office Safeguarding Hub, in my experience, aren't bad, actually, once you finally get through to them. That's as lukewarm a praise as I can give it, I think. They will pick up the email and they will look into the issue. The other thing that they can do as well, if you've got someone that's been waiting for status for 8-9 years and it's really impacting on their mental health, raise that with the Safeguarding Hub. See what you can do to get that decision generated. The Safeguarding Hub can speak to case owners. The Safeguarding Hub can speak to the accommodation provider. So be mindful of that Safeguarding Hub. Raise everything with them. A lot of people aren't aware that the Home Office even have that facility, so please do use it if it's helpful to you. If you're working with anyone in detention, any kind of risk that you come across within people that are in detention centres, you raise it with the welfare team in the first instance. You can also raise that and escalate it to the Home Office Safeguarding Hub. The other thing that we always say is have legal reps lined up in your local geographic area. Know which solicitors are around who'd be prepared to work with you. Build those collaborations, build those strategic partnerships up with those legal reps, so that when you have got someone that is in a situation of risk and the accommodation provider isn't addressing it, they're not moving them from their current accommodation, or they're refusing to moving them back to the area where they had a local connection and they had a local support network. Legal reps and pre-action protocols are really, really useful as a tool to get the outcome that you want to get. Obviously, parliamentarians and other advocacy routes, building those relationships with your local MPs and councillors when you've got other people at risk. And always, there's a myth in our sector that if you're working with NRPF people, that's no recourse to public funds, that local authorities don't have any duties towards them. That's not true. Local authorities do have duties towards people, even if they are no recourse to public funds. For example, if you're working with a family with children, Section 17 of the Children Act still applies to children that are NRPF. And Section 17 is a fantastic provision because it gives the local authority a very broad duty to do whatever is necessary in the interests of that child. Not necessarily a duty towards parents, but always a duty towards the child. It's really worth being mindful of that. So again, painting that picture of identifying the safeguarding risk and using that as a route of advocacy to deliver an outcome for that human being in front of you. This is what we mean about safeguarding shouldn't pull you in a different direction. Good safeguarding practice should assist you in delivering that outcome for that human being in front of you. And that's what we try and help organizations do. Next slide, please. Oh, no, it's me. Oh, it's me. So common types of safeguarding risks when working with this client group. Obviously, we've talked about exploitation. Now, the main driver of the risk in exploitation is the cripplingly low asylum support rates. £8 a week in a hotel. How do you live on £8 a week in a hotel? The reality is, for most of people trying to live off that money, is that you don't. You get yourself sucked into quite often dangerous situations, dangerous working situations. We've seen with unaccompanied asylum seeking children and other unaccompanied migrant children that quite often they can be moved into exploitation, cannabis houses, young women going into nail bars, car washes. This is exploitation in the UK. And as I said, one of the main drivers is NRPF and low asylum support rates. We are not touching the surface of the real problem of exploitation in the UK, in my view. So look out for those indicators. And I think what I always try and do is have a really honest and open dialogue with people. it's really hard living on this money. How are you making this work for you? Are you doing any other work? Where is it? What's going on? Lots of open questions, lots of trusting, honest dialogue with people. The second main consideration is trafficking. Trafficking is frightening, and I think quite often we all feel slightly frightened about trafficking, not sure what to do with it, not sure how to identify it, not sure where to go when you have identified it. Where does that intersection sit between an actual situation of trafficking and someone you've suspected has been trafficked or is at risk of trafficking? Now, obviously, and the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, I think is something that sometimes feels a little frightening as well, something kind of strange and over there. I think the important things to note with the NRM is, like every other Home Office protection route, it's absolutely broken at the moment. Decisions aren't coming through for the NRM. There's huge backlog on the NRM and a huge delay. But essentially, the NRM is brilliant if it works as it should. What happens when you refer someone into the National Referral Mechanism is that they should get an initial reasonable grounds decision. And that's where a decision maker will look at whether or not they feel that there is a case to inquire as to whether or not they've been trafficked. And if they feel, yes, on paper, there looks like there's a claim here, what they'll do is issue a positive reasonable grounds decision. Then that person will be offered accommodation, offered support, counselling, until the conclusive grounds decision comes through. And that conclusive grounds decision basically says yes or no, that person has or has not been trafficked. The reason why it's really good is that support's much better within the NRM. It's a good route to safety and status that goes with the NRM. In the last quarterly stats, it was shown that I think around 86% of people were getting an initial reasonable grounds decision that had gone into the NRM. So of those referrals, 86% were approved as reasonable. And of those, 91% went on to get conclusive grounds decisions. So it's huge numbers of people proportionately are getting status through the NRM. So it is something to be really mindful of. Again, with trafficking, don't forget that you can be trafficked within the UK. It's not just about how you get into the UK, but one of the top 3 nationalities receiving conclusive grounds decision was English. You can be trafficked within the UK, so something really to be mindful of there. Sort of questions to be asking about trafficking. Do people have their passports? Do they have control of their money? How did they get into the UK? What's the circumstances of that? I find with trafficking in the cases that Tracy and I have worked with, the most important thing there is just instinct. You tend to not get a disclosure of trafficking and exploitation. You tend to just get details that just don't feel right. They don't quite seem right. And you need to do a bit of digging in it. And then you put the referral through, people get some safe space, they get some support, and then you start to see that actually some of the detail starts to emerge from people at that stage. There are some brilliant trafficking and exploitation organisations. I always recommend ATLU. I think they're fantastic. But usually you can put a referral through to the NRM via a whole range of different organisations, including Refugee Council and some of the other regional refugee charities. One of the biggest issues that we're seeing with our client group at the moment is, of course, mental health crisis and suicidal ideation. Tracy and I facilitate a monthly meeting of senior safeguarding leads in the refugee and asylum sector just to talk and come together. And they will say each month the number one issue that they're dealing with is mental health crisis and suicidal ideation. Particularly the length of time asylum decision makings are taking at the moment, the housing conditions. We've got people in hotels, we've got people in terrible asylum accommodation of very low housing standards. We've got people unable to reunite with their family, people in huge poverty for years on end, plus the trauma of your journey to the UK. That's all going to compound into some significant mental health crisis. And I think as a sector, this is one of the ones that we let the Home Office off the hook a lot with. Actually, if you looked across the asylum system, and if you looked at the number of people that were suffering with their mental health, we need to be driving those incidents of mental health crisis to the Home Office a lot more, I think. With mental health crisis, suicidal ideation, we always say immediate safety planning in the moment. So make sure that your team know how to do a basic safety plan with someone. That looks at, what are the triggers for any mental health crisis, suicidal ideation, what helps a human feel better in that moment, mapping their support networks, where are their friends, do they have cousins here, is there anyone that they can talk to, but critically understanding that you can call 999, you can ask for an ambulance, you can ask for a police to do a welfare check. You can also, as providers, you can also speak to someone's GP on their behalf to disclose concerns that you have about that human, and to try and expedite GP referrals through to community mental health provision. But the mental health system is highly broken at the moment, and we know people are waiting a very, very long time to get any support with their own mental health. The other thing you can do is work locally within your networks to identify your mental health provision and see if you can start to develop projects with them. There's some great examples of mental health, refugee mental health charities around the UK. If, for example, you've got Solace in Yorkshire and Humber, who are just magnificent, one of the best providers of refugee mental health support. Go and look at who your local provider is. And if you're having any trouble finding them, give us a shout anytime and we'll do what we can to help you. Domestic abuse is another significant problem with our client group. Again, highly pressurized environments, lots of trauma within family units, trying to live in difficult housing situations on low income. That puts pressure on a relationship, and quite often that can result in situations of domestic abuse, including coercive controlling behaviour. One key thing to note here, if you work with parents, you are also working with children. We hear quite a lot, well, we don't work with children. You do. If you're working with parents, you're working with children, you have responsibilities towards those children as well. And a recent change in legislation, if a child is living within a household where there is domestic abuse, that is a child protection concern and it should be disclosed to your local authority. Please be mindful of that. So if you receive a disclosure, say hypothetically, I don't like to be gender typical, but hypothetically you're working with mum discloses that dad is violent towards her or controlling towards her, you cannot keep that confidential to mum. If there are children involved in that, you have to work with mum to disclose that to the local authority. The local authority need to be aware of that situation. They might not do anything, but they do need to be aware of it. Hate crime and far right extremism. I mean, we've all seen the lists of hotels going around social media and the journalists telling people exactly where asylum hotels are being put. We know that our client group are highly minoritized, highly racialized, and that our Home Secretary and a lot of our politicians are feeding a lot of this rhetoric at the moment. If you're doing any work in hotels, please be mindful of your own safety within that environment as well. Please make sure that your staff and volunteers aren't leaving alone. They're not arriving alone, that you're planning safe routes to and from the hotel for your staff and volunteers, and that you've got a really good dialogue with the people that you're working with. Explain to people what a hate crime is, explain to people what that form of racism is and their rights within it, because hate crime is something we use in the UK, but it's a very culturally nuanced term. If you're a refugee from a war zone, you might not have any concept of what a hate crime is. So do be mindful to explain that to people so that they know that they can involve the police. And as I said, please don't forget your own safety and well-being in terms of the risks to your teams entering and leaving those hotels. FGM and other gender-based violence is another key risk with this client group. And we say there are risk assessment, FGM risk assessment proformas that you can adopt that will help guide you through some of those processes. Sorry, I'm mindful of time, so spinning through. And it's back over to Tracy.
Great. I'll just whiz through these because they're quite self-explanatory, the next few slides, but we just wanted to touch on basic safeguarding compliance, as we get asked a lot of questions around sort of, okay, we really want to focus on safeguarding and maybe overhaul our policies and our approach at the organisation. What do we need to do? How do we do this? So actually, responsibilities for sort of charitable organisations or organisations in general, when you look down at what the almost like minimum requirements are, there's not that much there. We're talking about, you know, having a children's safeguarding policy and vulnerable adults or an adults at risk policy that just sets out how you will work as an organisation to ensure you safeguard children and adults. Relevant insurance, you need to think about safer recruitment, how this sits with safeguarding in HR. It's not that there is a pro forma of this is how it needs to be done. It will be very, very different for each organisation, and the depth level of these policies or approaches will be very different depending on the activities you run and your size and scope, really. Clear lines of escalation and reporting. In some organisations that might be one person reporting to one other person, it might be a very small grassroots organisation. In others, it might be that you've got sort of 300 people working on a project, and you know there's a much bigger process in place there. But it's having those clear lines of escalation, ensuring there's safeguarding training for all, and that's reviewed. Usually we'd say at least every 2 years. It's good to have a bit of a refresher annually if there's capacity, but again, it's all very dependent on what the organisation does and the type of work that you carry out. Making sure that your designated safeguarding lead has some specific training as well around, you know, their role, their responsibilities, how are they managing risk. And then understanding the Charity Commission reporting requirements as well, because there's certain incidents that will need escalating to the Charity Commission. So just being really clear around those. And then when we're looking sort of at good safeguarding practice, maybe moving away from what we need as a minimum, but actually what do we want to deliver as organisations when looking at this area of work. Making sure that we're repeating that training, making sure all our staff, volunteers and trustees are involved. We might go into specialisms, so rather than just a generic safeguarding, as Lou was saying, is there something, you know, are you seeing at your organisation a lot of issues around mental health or around domestic abuse? Can we do some specialised training around that to really upskill staff and make them feel confident, and volunteers too? That data collection, that advocacy, making sure everybody gets an induction around safeguarding as well. Again, there's really clear escalation policies so that it goes from just being something that you've got to have on paper but doesn't necessarily work in practice to something that's really effective, really puts, again, safety and safeguarding at the heart of the work that you're doing. Statement of values around your safeguarding practice as well. You know, what is it that you're doing? Why are you doing this? Who are you trying to protect? And that is organisational, not just sort of our clients, our service users there. And then practice guidance on common themes. So I think sometimes people feel very overwhelmed by policies, but that's often because bits of guidance might be in there. We're not sure where to put these different things. Actually, in simple terms, we need policies that underpin how our organisation approaches this. And then actually in practice, what do people do daily that's going to be really sort of important for them to safeguard the people they're supporting. And then lastly, people that work directly with children, young people or adults at risk, you know, there will be a requirement for a DBS check at a role appropriate level. And then again, that's standard adult and child safeguarding and more specific on certain areas dependent on role. But DBS has some really good information on the sort of role requirements there to meet the different tiers of DBS.
Just one note on the DBS thing to be mindful of as well. Overchecking is as bad and as illegal as underchecking. There's this approach that, oh, you know, we'll just get an enhanced check for everyone, and then we'll earn on the side of safety. No, you can't do that. You have to get the right check for the right role. So be mindful of that as well. Just the last thing from us is think about that whole organization approach, pivoting the organization around people's safety. That's right from the chief executive all the way down to sort of non-operational staff as well. Thinking about if you've got a fundraising team, thinking about if you've got someone that runs your social media, your Twitter accounts, all of those people also need to understand how to operate safety within your organization. So really pivoting the whole organization around safety and well-being for everyone involved in it. And that's it from us for our presentation. So I will stop sharing this screen and we'll see if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you so much, Lou and Tracy, and thank you. I apologize to everyone. For some reason, my computer decided to freeze mid thing, which is rather amusing because Lou and I had discussed who should be doing this, who will be pressing. I thought I would make it easier for you two to if I did it, but alas, no. Thanks, everyone.
The thing is, I've got, Sarah's being very polite. You see, I've got form with having terrible presentations at City of Sanctuary where the presentation will fail at the last minute. So we were being really organised, weren't we, Sarah?
Yes, so we thought. But there was a question in the chat, and I know there's a hand raised. So first I'll go to the question that was in the chat, and then we can pick up the hand. So someone asked, does the local authority have responsibility for children of asylum seekers in hotels, or does the Home Office hold that responsibility?
Home Office holds the primary responsibility, but local authorities have responsibility for any child on their patch.
Okay.
So, and you will get bounced back. So you'll ring the local authority to make a disclosure about a child. You'll say that the child's in the asylum seekers hotel, and the local authority say go to the Home Office. No, that child's in your geographic patch. It is your responsibility. Do you know it's even local authority responsibility if there's a detention centre in their patch that there are concerns about a detainee? The local authority has responsibility for everything that goes on in their geographic patch. Of course, the Home Office should be dealing with it in the first instance, and the local authority are quite right to drive it to the Home Office. But if you can't get the Home Office to deal with it and address the concern, then absolutely go to local authority. Tracy, do you agree?
Absolutely. And I'm just thinking of some meetings I've sat in where actually you've got to be, I think, really mindful and feel your own skills and knowledge in this, where you might be in, say, a child protection meeting or any sort of meeting involving the child and have the local authority on one side and the Home Office on the other arguing about funding. And I know we find that a lot in all areas of this sort of work, but actually sometimes the actual safeguarding issue is lost at the middle of that. And we sometimes have to cut through that and say, do you know what? There is, say, a situation of domestic abuse and there's a child that's at really immediate risk here. It doesn't matter who wants to take responsibility, but somebody needs to sort this situation out. And I think sometimes people's legal status overtakes the actual safeguarding risk. So it's just being mindful in those meetings that we really have to sometimes advocate and bring it back to the safeguarding, even if we feel like we're not always the what's the right word, the professional that's maybe the one leading on the safeguarding in those issues.
Thank you.
So,
yeah,
I've got a question that's come through to me on a direct message, and I think actually it's one that applies to probably quite a few of your groups. Can I read that
go ahead. There's a couple other ones, and I'm mindful there's one or two hands up, but you do that one first, and then we'll go to the hands and try and work our way through all the questions.
Lovely. So this is a question around working particularly in hotels around mental health crisis, depression, and potential self-harm and suicidal ideation. What should individuals and groups be doing? I mean, this is where I say I would say 90 to 100% of our service users are at risk. When you step into an asylum hotel, you see it straight away. I'd say this is a massively common issue. I would say try and do some group work. try and open the dialogue with people at a group level to about mental health awareness. Start talking about mental health. Start talking about how you can construct safety for people within that dynamic, and then potentially start to follow that up with one-to-one with people that you're particularly concerned about. What roots them? What makes them feel safer in that moment? What's their aspirations? What is it? What are they aiming for? And how can we keep reminding them of that? That can hold people in the moment, but it's not going to address the systemic issues that are feeding that mental health crisis. I think, honestly, yeah, absolutely. You might have to do this 10 or 20 times a week, but escalate it to those 3 contacts: the accommodation provider, migrant help, and the Home Office safeguarding hub. I say this to everyone, it becomes exhausting, and I get it. And sometimes you think, what's the point in keep sending these emails to the Home Office when they're never going to address these issues? Do it. Do it, otherwise you're letting them off the hook. Do it because it can help with that individual case to try and get them move through that system better. It can help also with the asylum determination, because the Home Office decision maker can access that information on the safeguarding hub, and it can see that that person's suffering from a mental health crisis or suicidal ideation, which can often support the overarching claim for protection as well. Escalate every single concern. Don't let them get off the hook. If you have to develop template emails, do it. I would also as well work with the local authority, help them understand the level of mental health crisis that's happening within their yard, and look at whether or not together you can bring a mental health charity into that environment, one of those local, maybe one of your regional refugee mental health charities. So I gave the example of Solace in Yorkshire earlier. There's one of the asylum hotels in Liverpool I know are starting to do some mental health group work within that hotel environment. So can you map on one of what Tracy was talking about, is know your expertise and work collaboratively around your gaps. Can you map where your mental health expertise is within your area? Can you bring them into some of that group environment to start working around well-being? But all you're ever going to be doing within those hotel environments is trying to hold people together for as long as possible until they can get the hell out of there and get status. That's a really uncomfortable situation, but we have to own that as a sector and say, if that's all we can do is try and keep people together, then let's do that.
Thank you, Lou. I'm mindful Amy Good Enough has had her hand up a little bit. Would you like to come in now, Amy?
Yeah, hi. I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, because domestic abuse is my field, and I've been very upset that the UK didn't ratify the articles in the Istanbul Convention to protect migrant women whose residency status depends on their abuser. And I wondered if what you said earlier about how any child who is living around domestic abuse is a victim in their own right, could we use that route as a way to get that mother, normally a mother, isn't it, to get her the help that she is? Is there a way of circumventing that lack of protection for those women?
Firstly, I really share your anger about that. I think in the UK, there's the question of, I think particularly women that are tied to spousal visas. I think there's particular issues around domestic abuse, but I think the Home Office routinely, certainly within the asylum system, where you've got an asylum claim the husband and wife are on, and then their domestic abuse then evidences itself subsequent to that initial claim for asylum. There is, I think their approach to it is particularly pernicious. Tracy and I supported a case a little while ago of mum and 2 children fleeing a situation of abuse from husband and dad. Husband and dad got to stay in the 2-bedroomed community dispersal accommodation, and mum and 2 children were moved into a hotel the other side of the country, with 2 children having left their schools, GPs, and they were in that hotel for some considerable months. So it's not just the legislative environment. I guess I'm saying it's also the cultural approach of the asylum providers, the Home Office contractors to domestic abuse. It's appalling at every level. So the reason we always note the impact to children giving rise to a local authority involvement and intervention is quite often you'll get a better result with local authority intervention around domestic abuse than you will from Serco intervening on a domestic abuse situation. So yes, absolutely. Sorry, it's a long answer to your question, but yes, absolutely. In light of woeful approaches to domestic abuse in asylum providers, that knowing that the impact on the child is it can give rise to a child protection concern, go down that local authority route if you can. And even if the local authority won't intervene directly, in our experience, that one particular case, it ultimately ended up in a case conference. And the local authority were really helpful actually in driving change in Serco and Migrant Helps and the Home Office's approach to how badly they treated these mum and two children.
Thank you, Lou. I'm going to take one question from the chat and then I'll go to you, Lynn, in just a minute. But so one of the questions in the chat is from Denise, and she asks, in the last few years, we've not been able to do DBS checks for our volunteers as we are told that refugees are not vulnerable. Has this changed?
So it's not changed per se. So DBS is that probably still stands. So refugees don't come under that vulnerable category because the category DBS use is adults at risk in terms of legislation. So it's a really, there's a really clear category in terms of on DBS's website. Can be a bit tricky to navigate, but we can send follow-up links as well, where it'd be only in very sort of specific circumstances that supporting a refugee, you would have to be carrying out X, Y, and Z work in order to meet the threshold to get a certain DBS. So it's not saying that every role should be DBS checked unless you decide as an organisation for a basic check, which anybody can get. The standard and enhanced level have very set criteria which are set out. And obviously I don't know everybody's organisations and projects, but I'd imagine that for the majority, we don't meet the thresholds for standard and enhanced in certain roles. So check those out. So it's not that that's changed and you're doing anything wrong there. It's just mapping against that criteria. And there are organisations you can go to get roles assessed if you're unsure if it meets the criteria or not. I know one of you can go back and check on, but yeah, vulnerable adults per se, that term is not, you know, as much as we know there is a lot of vulnerabilities with people we support, they don't come under that legal term of vulnerable or adult at risk necessarily.
Thanks for clarifying. And I should just note, we'll send the slides and the video of this all around to everyone after the session today. But also we did a session with a DBS officer about 1.5 years ago who talked about and did a presentation about kind of when and how you should think about getting checks. So I'll include that link for people who might not have caught it at the time. I'm going to go to Lynn Goswell, who has her hand, you have your hand up?
Yeah, this is a question relates to the domestic abuse, but it's a much, in a way, kind of mild one. And this is to do with the difference in views about domestic abuse within these families. For example, a mother whose husband insists that she has another baby, although she's got 2 very young children and is exhausted and has mental health issues, and is unwilling to proceed because she feels that he has a right to insist that she has yet another child. So, you know, this is a difference of view, isn't it, as to, is this domestic abuse? And well, it is, but
it's really tricky, isn't it? Because we want to respect people's different cultures, different heritage, but ultimately, when you settle in the United Kingdom, we have laws, and it's our job to help people understand the law and culture as a minimum in the UK, by which people should be free to express themselves within the boundaries of that law and culture. But I think that the Home Office not having any integration support for people seeking asylum is creating a lot of problems from a safeguarding perspective, because they're not talking to people about, you know, what domestic abuse is, what gender-based respect and rights are in the UK. Usually with a resettled refugee, there would be a package of support that cover those sort of elements of cultural integration into the UK and what the laws in the UK is. You don't have that with people seeking asylum, and it really needs to be there. In the absence of that, it's probably going to fall on us to step into that space again and say to people, no, this is the law in the UK. You know, you can't compel your wife or manipulate her into having another child, and making sure that wife and mum knows that as well. There's a really interesting question in the chat, I think, that intersects with some of this as well. In that sort of situation, obviously, you'd work with mum, you'd work with dad, you'd try and seek a resolution there. But ultimately, it's their decision around what they want to do. I think where it gets more difficult is where you're looking at potentially levels of criminality, and it breaks thresholds. So other forms of gender-based violence, other forms of domestic violence and domestic abuse. And there's a question, I think, in the chat, Sarah, about consent and the intersection of consent. I'm sure I saw it somewhere there. But I think someone asked a question on when do we, do you always need consent to escalate mental health concerns? Also for children, do you need parents' consent? Parking, mental health, and just talking about consent across the board when it comes to safeguarding is something that a lot of people have a lot of questions on. We call this a permitted disclosure. You never, ever break confidentiality, and people say, oh, we're going to break confidentiality. No, you're not. You're never going to break confidentiality. We never break confidentiality. But within our confidentiality policy, there should be a clause which permits a disclosure to certain statutory authorities. If someone is at risk of harm or someone poses a risk of harm to someone else, you can disclose those details to the relevant statutory authorities. You should only ask consent if you feel that it will not raise the level of risk to anyone concerned in doing so. So in a situation of domestic abuse where mum makes a disclosure of domestic abuse, but she says to maybe, please don't tell the police, or please don't tell, I don't want a social worker knowing. If there are children involved in that situation, depending on the level of risk, depending on the type of abuse, you will have to disclose that to the local authority regardless of mum's consent. You similarly, if someone says to you, I'm going to hurt myself, you would do an immediate safety plan. What's their level of planning and preparation? Have they really thought it through? Do they really know? What's the detail behind that? Do they know when? Do they know how? And if you're pretty convinced that they are going to hurt themselves, then you will need to disclose that to the emergency services or to a relevant health professional, regardless of their consent to do so. You should only seek consent if it's safe to do so and it's not going to increase anyone's risk. I hope that answers both sort of questions in a roundabout way.
The only thing I'm going to add really, really quickly, 10 seconds, just coming back to Lynn's point, was around leaning to other professionals who might be involved as well. So in terms of when you were saying about the mum and having 2 young children, it might be that she's got an allocated health visitor, and it might be that, you know, she doesn't see them very often because I know their time's very tight now and they're very busy. But you know, with mum's consent in that sort of situation, it could be that you seek support from the health visitor to maybe talk to mum about some of those issues within that dynamic as well. So don't feel you have to take it on yourself. You can absolutely instigate those multi-agency meetings, you know, if it's not at that risk threshold with the consent of mum, but it, you know, it can be general chats with the health visitor. We don't have to say we're going to get health visitor in to speak to you about this. It could be a support perspective. Sorry, conscious of time.
No, it's okay. Do you mind taking a few more questions, because they're coming in kind of thick and fast in the chat, and I know there's 1 or 2 that I may have not picked up. So Rosemary in the chat asked, and you've touched a little bit on this, Lou, but maybe you can talk about it more, is, you know, you mentioned the protocols around suicide ideation. Can you tell us more about getting or using this, or give a link? So do you have some ideas?
So usually it's usually it's just organizational approaches and support to your team around safety planning in that moment. So someone says, I'm going to kill myself this evening. What are you asking your colleague, your staff member, your volunteer to respond with in that moment? And that's where practice guidance is really important. Typically, the ideal response would be, right, tell me a little bit more about that. How is that going to happen? How, you know, are you prepared for that? Have you thought it through? We want to know how real that is. And if it's really real, we need to get urgent help to that individual, and it's 999. It's a 999. I need an ambulance. Someone's going to hurt themselves, and you know the address goes straight through. It's also, if they're in asylum accommodation provider, migrant help, home office. Now Tracy and I have had some awful responses from the asylum accommodation provider where you put in an urgent request for a welfare check. They don't bother picking it up. They might do a check a week later. I've had someone who had form. I mean, God love him. He some very, very high profile suicide attempts. And then he disclosed that he purchased lighter fluid and he was going to set himself alight. So he was a very clear and pronounced intention to take his life. And the response from the accommodation provider was to warn him for having a substance in his asylum accommodation that he was not permitted to have, and that was it. That's all they did. So the accommodation provider will give you an awful response, probably. Home office are a little bit more helpful. Migrant help may be a little bit more helpful. But generally, the best response you're going to get is from 999 ambulance. If you're lucky, they'll have a mental health ambulance in that patch. A mental health ambulance is usually a car with a mental health professional and a police officer. The police officer always goes so that they can, because police have power to place someone under a mental health section, whereas a nurse doesn't. So they usually go in twos, but they're thin on the ground with cuts to the NHS. You might get a generic ambulance. If you can't get any of those, if the waiting list is too long, you can call 999 and ask for the police to do a welfare check as well, and they will intervene. However, it's not easy to call the police when you're working with this community, because we know that there's a real fear of the police. So that's a difficult decision, and one that you'll really need to talk about. So really what you need in your organizations is practice guidance around dealing and responding to mental health crisis that talks about what questions are you asking your staff to go through with that human? How do we immediately make sure they're safe, like for the next hour, while we get support to them? Who are your local mental health professionals that you can pull into that as well? And don't forget, you can also speak to the GP, and you can do that without consent if you need to. So I think like a mental health guidance, there isn't any protocol that you can bring in sort of that exists. You're going to have to develop that. But it's something you will have expertise in your organization around this. You will know more than you think you know about this. And try and think through, like your own guidance around what you want people to do would be my advice.
It's one of our, oh, sorry. I was just going to say it's one of our planned sessions as well. So we deliver more in-depth training on mental health and suicidal ideation, and it's quite practical in approach to that. And, you know, you're in this situation, what do you say? What do you do? How do you feel confident? So that's the information's on our website around that. It's quite a long session, that one.
Thank you, Tracy. That's great to know. I mean, this does segue neatly into another question that we got from M. Pruitt, who asks, are there any accessible examples of safeguarding guidance for different roles and activities written in plain English? And I think that's around what is it, you know, we've all seen the safeguarding policies, which can be quite dense with, you know, making sure that you reference the right statutory bodies, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, this guidance that you talk about, you know, do you have some examples of that, you know, potentially could be shared, or, you know, suggestions?
We don't. We run our own training, and we can support you with the developing that. Check out our website and we'll help you. The reason why we formed Safer Foundations, Tracy and I. So Tracy is the finely tuned social worker, safeguarding expert, and I am the blunt spoon of operations, is what I always consider myself to be, next to Tracy's finely tuned mind. Basically, she has all of the technical stuff, and I have this is a human and this is how I want to help them, and how do I think this through plainly and with simplicity in that operational context. And I think that's something that's really lacking in the refugee and asylum sector, applying that contextual and technical aspect to the reality of working in a hotel environment or in a detention center. If that's something you're struggling with, that plain English, who do you need to be in that moment? What are the practical steps you need to take with that human? Give us a shout. We're always trying to find a way to help. We have training bursaries available. So if you don't have much money, if you're a small charity that's emerging, you can contact us, and we give away X amount of free training spaces and free support. We really, really want to help you guys to drive up your responses and pull those home office levers a little bit more productively. So give us a shout if we can help you with that.
We have about 5 more minutes, if that's all right, Lou and Tracy, to kind of chat through. I'm seeing loads of messages flying in, but I don't want to miss anyone off. Wendy has asked about physical health, such as, issues around scabies and diphtheria are circulating. Festive parties planned at drop-ins with large numbers expected. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts on that?
Lots. There's different levels and different layers of it. I think if you've got concerns about anyone's health in the asylum system, particularly with the situation in Manston, outbreak and the way that people have been treated through that process, escalate that immediately to the Home Office Safeguarding Hub. Someone dropped in the chat that the hub, what's the hub details? If you scroll through the chat, Tracy cut and pasted it as I was speaking in the presentation, so it's there.
I'll drop them back in.
We're going to send the
Perfect.
put all the links in the chat
Perfect.
around with those slides and your contact details. So
Perfect.
fear not that there'll be opportunities to capture what you need.
Thank you. So use that email address if you've got concerns about anyone presenting in your hotels and their health. Go straight to Home Office Migrant Help Asylum Accommodation Provider. As I said, do it to all three and let them argue it out between them. Otherwise, you're just going to get bounced back to between them. In terms of future proofing, and because this question has 2 parts, is how do you respond to someone with physical health needs, but also how do you risk assess Christmas coming up?
Yeah.
And the answer is do a risk assessment. Think about how you can do basic infection control procedures. We know that there's a lot of people that were in diabolical situations in Manston that have been shuffled out into the UK in various different hotels. The Home Office don't seem to give a monkeys about infection control, basic infection control procedures, now that they've subjected everyone to these infections. So you're going to have to do that. Once again, it comes on us to fill in the gaps of the statutory providers. You're going to have to do that. Now, I think given COVID, a lot of us have become a lot wiser around basic infection control procedures. You're going to have to repurpose probably some of what might have been in your COVID risk assessment procedures and apply that to some of your asylum hotel procedures. I'm really hopeful that that's just a precaution. I'm really hopeful that actually we're not going to see significant outbreaks, but be cautious. Think about not churning your staff too much in different hotels. Think about not becoming super spreaders yourself. Think about how you can have sort of fire breaks a little bit in between your working slots. Simple operational procedures to manage some of those risks for a little while. But as I said, any sign of any physical health needs, straight away, go to the Home Office.
Thank you. There is a lot of gratitude being shared in the chat. So if you haven't seen that, Lou, Tracy, it seems as if people are finding this session very helpful. I hope I've captured most of the questions in the chat. If I have not, please feel free final last question, you know, raise your hand. We can maybe have one more before we draw the session to a close. I
I
don't
do
see
think
any.
if anything, somebody might be asking, waiting for that. I just wanted to add that NCVO, I'm sure a lot of people use the website and are aware, have really, really good safeguarding guidance as well. So going back to some of the things that Lou was saying, it doesn't give the content specific to our sector, but what it does provide is a really simple terms framework of, if you're in an organisation, think, oh, I've got a new safeguarding lead, what does that mean? You can go on there, it is separated down into different roles, responsibilities, what the minimum requirements are that you need to do as an organisation. So although you'll have to come up with the content yourself, or as Lisa, give us a shout, the actual framework is there. So really good resources on NCVO.
Great, thank you. I don't see any more other than absolutely fantastic, very useful. So thanks. It's really we're really pleased that this has hopefully been useful for people in attendance today. Just to note that we are at City of Sanctuary UK currently developing a whole set of sort of support to organizations around operations and safeguarding. We'll be looking at everything from, you know, governance issues and things in the coming months. So get in touch with us if you want to share any particular operational challenges that you might be having as a group or an institution that works and supports refugees and asylum seekers. Hopefully one of my kind colleagues has dropped in the chat. We are looking for some donations at this time of year. I know it's a tough time and the cost of living crisis is impacting us all, but anything you could throw our way really helps us to continue to try and support our networks. And I just thank you all for giving up your time today, and a huge thank you to the marvelous team over at Safer Foundations. Please check out their website, exploit their kind offers to give further support and advice, and hopefully we will see you all here in another webinar soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.